Bill Clinton thought he could dismiss Jasmine Crockett's entire legal career with one smug jab, until she stood, calm and unshaken, and unleashed a folder of receipts that rewrote the room. What happens when the old guard's arrogance collides with a new generation's proof? The answer left Clinton in stunned silence. Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The chandeliers of the Democratic Leadership Conference ballroom shimmered against a backdrop of velvet blue drapes, the kind of setting designed for control and comfort. At the podium stood Bill Clinton, his practiced smile taut, cufflinks glinting each time he adjusted his notes. Donor tables hushed, forks paused midair, and the distant clink of ice in glasses seemed to vanish into the silence. Cameras tightened their focus, sensing the moment about to tip. Clinton leaned forward, the old rhythm of his drawl curling into something sharper, more pointed. "We've got folks crafting federal policy who couldn't litigate a parking ticket," he said, pausing long enough to let the insult sink in. The words landed heavy, cloaked as humor, but weighted with dismissal. A few loyalists chuckled, their laughter clipped and hesitant. Others exchanged glances across linen-covered tables, discomfort etched in their eyes. On the press risers, a young staffer leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "He's going there." Nancy Pelosi blinked slowly, arms crossing. Chuck Schumer lowered his hands, fingers folding as though bracing for impact. The camera panned, finding Jasmine Crockett at her table, posture still, hand resting firmly on a slim graphite folder. Her jawline tightened, unmoving, but her eyes carried the weight of anticipation. She didn't fidget, didn't reach for her glass, didn't even blink too quickly. She was waiting. The tension threaded tighter when Clinton doubled down. "We need experience, not courtroom theatrics designed for social media," he added, his voice rising above the murmurs. This time, the laughs didn't ripple as easily. A hush fell, broken only by the faint hum of a bass note through the sound system, an undercurrent that seemed to amplify the air itself. Crockett's microphone caught a measured inhale, the kind that fills silence with promise. Then she stood. The click of her heels echoed against marble, sharp and deliberate, each step pulling every gaze in the room toward her. Phones tilted upward, cameras recalibrated, a boom mic dipped in anticipation. She reached the center aisle and spoke with a calm that cut through the static. "Since we're auditioning resumes, let's review them all." Her hand unclasped the folder, the metallic snap punctuating the air like a gavel. Clinton's smile faltered, half an inch gone, and the ballroom froze in collective breath as the screen smashed to black. The public defender's bullpen in Dallas was never quiet. Phones buzzed, clerks hurried, and case files stacked like towers of fragile glass. In that environment, Jasmine Crockett cut her teeth, learning discipline that was less about drama and more about endurance. She would sit under buzzing fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning, eyes scanning affidavits and handwritten witness statements, circling contradictions, in red. Her clients, often poor, often overlooked, were the kind who left her courtroom either in chains or in tears of relief. When verdicts turned in their favor, some hugged her outside the courthouse with gratitude that outlasted the ink of the day's headlines. These were the moments that hardened her conviction. The law wasn't a theater. It was a lifeline. Years later, standing on the steps of the Dallas County Courthouse, hand raised to be sworn in, Crockett understood her career as a continuum rather than a pivot. She wasn't abandoning defense work when she entered Congress. She was scaling it. Her reputation followed her into Washington like a calling card. She was the one who pulled receipts but didn't raise her voice. In committee hearings, her weapon was time. A witness might dodge and weave for 15 minutes under generic questioning, but Crockett's habit was to wait, lay down one document, then another, then pause and force silence to finish her sentence. Those clips, replayed on social media, revealed her rhythm. Patient, precise, devastating. Her core code was not negotiation but fidelity. She once remarked privately to a colleague, "If you call my work small, you're calling the Constitution small." To her, truth wasn't a tactic that could be deployed or withdrawn based on context. It was a duty, one that demanded she verify everything, date stamp every claim, source it twice, and anticipate 3 counterpunches before making her own move. The graphite folder she carried into the ballroom was not a spur-of-the-moment prop. It was a culmination of weeks of curation, ethics orders, timelines, direct quotes, and neutral summaries laid out with the care of a litigator who knew the stakes were as much about perception as evidence. Her case ledger back in Texas told the same story. She'd won dismissals on Fourth Amendment violations where sloppy searches had endangered rights. She'd steered appeals that overturned wrongful convictions. She'd bargained plea reforms that reduced sentences for nonviolent offenders. Each page, each filing, was a reminder that the law only served when someone was willing to demand it be honored in full. But behind the discipline lay an emotional anchor that never left her. As a black woman, every time her credentials were questioned, it wasn't just about her resume. It was a rehearsal of every conference room, every court, every stage where she had been expected to prove it, while others were simply assumed competent. Clinton's jab wasn't new, it was an echo, and echoes sharpened resolve. That is why, when she rose with her folder, her voice carried calm but her preparation carried fire. She had anticipated the moment, prepared for the stage, and delivered her foreshadow with the conviction of lived truth. Intimidation is a volume knob, she had written in her notes the night before. Documentation is a light switch. That was the mindset she carried into the confrontation, and that was the reason silence in the ballroom would soon belong to her. Bill Clinton did not arrive at that podium as just another former president. He arrived as the emblem of an era, the comeback kid, the man whose charm and intelligence had once steered a party through the turbulence of the 90s into economic boom and cultural resonance. The legacy reel was always at hand. Rope lines with ordinary people leaning in, his empathetic nod. The way he seemed to make any voter feel seen. Those images lived beside less flattering split screens, the scandals, the investigations, the law, suspension. For Clinton, charisma and baggage were inseparable, 2 sides of the same presidential coin. His skill set was undeniable. He could fill a room with energy, bend a narrative mid-sentence, and turn even pointed critiques into folksy parables that made audiences laugh despite themselves. Entire generations of Democratic operatives had studied his cadence, the rhythm of dropping tension before reeling it back with a story. To many donors in that ballroom, Clinton remained a figure of authority, a keeper of standards, a reminder of a time when political performance was measured by electoral victory and triangulated consensus. That night, however, his swing was not merely about nostalgia. Clinton wanted to recenter the party on experience, on the idea that policy should be rooted in years of hard grind, rather than courtroom bursts or viral committee clips. He believed his words would carry the weight of custodianship, signaling to younger members that there were lines, thresholds, standards they had not yet earned the right to cross. Crockett became, in his calculation, a proxy for the generation he sought to discipline. But the blind spot was glaring. Clinton often confused deference with unity, assuming that if younger leaders respected his history, they would temper their own fire in service of harmony. What he failed to recognize was that courtroom muscle outside corporate law was not a deficiency, but its own form of power. By diminishing Crockett's legal background, he underestimated precisely the tools that could dismantle his critique. In his war room, advisors had whispered, "Nudge the kids toward policy homework," believing a light reprimand would suffice. But a reprimand delivered in public can turn into a gauntlet, and Clinton had unknowingly thrown one down. The stakes were higher than personal pride. In that ballroom, donor confidence was on the line. Editorial boards would parse his remarks. Cable news would run split screens of his speech against Crockett's response. The story was not just about one man critiquing one congresswoman. It was about who defined qualified inside the Democratic Party. Whether the keepers of the past or the builders of the future, Clinton had built a scaffolding of credibility across decades, but scaffolding, once shaken, can collapse quickly. "If you attack an attorney's scaffolding," one aide muttered after the fact, "be sure yours holds." That was the foreshadow Clinton never quite heard. And as the ballroom waited, and as Crockett stood folder in hand, the test of whose foundation was stronger had already begun. Bill Clinton's voice filled the ballroom with that old trademark smoothness, palms open as though offering hard-won wisdom to a younger generation. His cadence was measured, every word calculated to suggest authority wrapped in humility. "Governing isn't a clinic," he said, pausing for effect. "It's a craft." The line landed like a sermon, pitched toward the donors who lined the tables with their crystal glasses and folded linen napkins. His tone carried the weight of a man who once bent narratives at will, who knew how to sell both policy and personality in the same breath. Then came the jab, sly but sharp. Clinton leaned into the podium, eyes narrowing as though addressing a troublesome student rather than a peer. "We've got folks in Congress," he said, letting the syllables stretch, "whose only courtroom time was arguing traffic violations and entry-level disputes. Now they want to write the laws of the land." His voice softened at the end, but the sting remained. The implication was clear. Jasmine Crockett's public defense career wasn't real experience. It was a preamble, a stage act, not the substance required to shape federal policy. A ripple ran through the room. Older donors, many of them veterans of the Clinton era, nodded approvingly. They remembered the roaring 90s, the prosperity, the charm. They wanted to believe he still had the authority to crown and to cut down. Yet the young organizer standing along the back wall stiffened, phones tilted higher. A journalist in the second row raised her lens, sensing something more than a polite jab. Clinton wasn't critiquing an idea. He was belittling a person. He pivoted again, trying to coat the attack with an aphorism. "Substance beats spectacle," he declared, shaking his head with a weary smile. "We can't afford leaders who see every issue as a viral moment, every committee hearing as a stage. Real governance takes more than courtroom theatrics designed for social media applause." The words seemed rehearsed, carefully layered to both complement his own legacy and dismiss Crockett's emerging voice. For a moment, the line drew clipped laughs from one side of the ballroom, polite chuckles from those who wanted to signal agreement without joining the fight. But the humor faltered midway, hanging heavy in the air. The younger crowd wasn't laughing. The donors shifted uneasily, suddenly aware that the attack had overshot its mark. Clinton's smile stayed fixed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. He could feel the room slipping. By the time he ended his volley, the tension was undeniable. Crockett hadn't moved yet, but every gaze was sliding toward her. The applause Clinton expected never arrived. Instead, the silence stretched, and the audience braced for the inevitable. The sense of overreach had settled in, and it would soon be answered. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, as if the weight of the room demanded deliberate steadiness. No flourish, no visible anger. She gathered her folder with precision, her steps across the marble deliberate, the faint clock of her heels echoing like a countdown. She reached the microphone, squared her shoulders, and without raising her voice, centered the mic as though she were about to conduct a deposition. Her first words cut through the static tension. "Public defense isn't small," she said, tone firm but calm. "It's the front line of constitutional law." A murmur moved through the audience, firm recognition that she wasn't dodging Clinton's attack but reframing the entire premise. She flipped the first page of her folder, revealing neatly tabbed notes. When a police officer violates the Fourth Amendment, when a prosecutor hides evidence, when someone poor is denied a fair trial, that is where the Constitution lives or dies. That's where I practiced. She didn't stop there. The receipts followed, rapid but precise. Dismissals on Fourth Amendment violations, successful appeals that freed wrongfully convicted men, plea reforms that restored balance where leverage had been abused. These weren't parking tickets, President Clinton. These were lives. And I didn't need a stage. I needed the law. The room shifted. A few donors leaned back, arms crossed as if weighing the evidence against their loyalty. Journalists scribbled faster, lenses zoomed tighter. Crockett continued, sliding from her own record to the broader picture. "In Congress, I've written statutory analysis, cross-referenced committee briefs with case law, and authored reforms rooted not in theory, but in lived constitutional practice. That is substance. That is governance." Then came the pivot, sharper now, her eyes lifting directly toward Clinton. "Since we're credential checking, perhaps we should review the Arkansas committee order, dated, docketed, and signed." Her hand tapped the folder, and a single sheet lifted just high enough for the cameras to catch the heading. The words, disciplinary, suspension were visible in bold. An audible gasp rippled through the ballroom. 2 coughs punctured the silence. Nancy Pelosi looked down at her hands. Chuck Schumer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Clinton's face tightened, his lip moistening under the lights. The audience no longer leaned on his charisma. They leaned forward toward the woman holding the folder, the woman turning the attack into a mirror. Crockett's delivery never broke cadence. Calm, documented, unflinching. She wasn't just answering the insult. She was repositioning the entire frame. If Clinton wanted a resume contest, she had one, and she had his. The silence that followed was thicker than velvet, broken only by the steady thrum of cameras, capturing every micro-expression. Crockett's gaze remained steady, her words sharp but unhurried. "You question my integrity," she said evenly, "but your license suspension questioned yours." The sentence landed like a gavel strike, not shouted, not embellished, simply documented truth, spoken aloud. The audience shifted again, the earlier nods of agreement evaporating into stunned stillness. Clinton, master of spin for decades, opened his mouth as though to interject, but the rhythm faltered. Crockett anticipated the move and pressed on, her voice steady enough to command the microphone. "Legal experience isn't measured in years served or titles held," he should. Clinton tried again, his voice half a register higher. But Crockett cut the attempt with composure. "I'm speaking to standards, not scandals," she said, refusing to let her tone escalate. The line neutralized him, framing her as the defender of principle rather than the participant in a spat. Then she closed the circle. "Respect is earned in discovery," she said, tapping the folder lightly, "not demanded at a podium." Her voice lowered just enough to invite the crowd to lean in, and they did. The donors who had chuckled minutes earlier were now still, some staring at their hands, others at Clinton, whose once glossy smile had hardened into something closer to stone. Applause began slowly, a scattered handful of claps. Then, as if a signal had been given, it grew, rolled, and sustained. The ovation wasn't wild, but heavy, deliberate, each clap echoing a shift in allegiance. The room had turned. Clinton stood frozen, hands resting on the podium, eyes fixed on the graphite folder as if it were ticking, ready to detonate again. The moderator, sensing the drama had reached its boiling point, leaned into the mic. "We'll take a short recess," he announced, voice quivering slightly under the weight of the moment. The applause continued even as people began to rise, phones already buzzing with live posts and frantic texts. Clinton's figure seemed smaller now, framed not by nostalgia, but by the shadow of accountability he had tried to cast on someone else. Crockett stepped back from the mic, collected her folder, and returned to her seat without looking at him. The statement had been made, the balance recalibrated. Clinton had arrived with the power of legacy, but she had left him with silence. And in that silence, the tables had fully, irreversibly turned. The clash did not stay confined to the ballroom. Within hours, clips of Bill Clinton's sharp jab and Jasmine Crockett's calm but devastating response were circulating in a relentless 2-beat montage. News stations ran it on loop, Clinton at the podium, smiling as he dismissed courtroom theatrics, followed immediately by Crockett's voice, steady and cold, saying, "Since we're auditioning resumes, let's review them all, mine and yours." The rhythm of that juxtaposition became irresistible television. Network chyrons framed the conflict with stark headlines. Recedes versus reputation across CNN. Old guard meets new rules flashing on MSNBC. Even Fox News, though skeptical, aired the clip under a banner reading "Party at War with Itself." The imagery cut deeper than a policy dispute. It was generational, cultural, almost familial. Clinton represented a legacy of power that had once defined the Democratic Party, while Crockett embodied a new guard, unwilling to doubt a nostalgia or hierarchy. Panel discussions erupted. On one side were Clinton loyalists, painting Crockett's move as disrespectful, even reckless. "He's a former president," one strategist insisted. "The institution matters." On the other side sat younger voices, activists and legal analysts who framed the moment as overdue accountability. "Respect isn't a trophy," one law professor countered. "It's earned and it can be lost." Crockett didn't attack him personally. She pulled documented receipts. That word, receipts, became a drumbeat of its own, echoing across social platforms and seeping into every roundtable debate. Late-night comedians found the drama irresistible. Jimmy Fallon quipped, "Bill Clinton came with a speech, Jasmine Crockett came with a case file." Seth Meyers added, "You know it's bad when you wish you had brought your harmonica to a cross-examination." Yet between the jokes, even comedy shows underscored a civic lesson, that public defense, the work Clinton had belittled, wasn't small, it was foundational. Trevor Noah devoted a monologue to breaking down what indigent defense meant for millions of Americans, using Crockett's calm defense of her profession as the anchor for explaining constitutional rights in plain English. Cable networks doubled down with explainers. MSNBC ran sidebars on what it meant for a lawyer to have a license suspended, contextualizing Clinton's history in Arkansas. CNN followed with a thread of graphics showing how many cases public defenders handle each year, framing Crockett's background as a crucible rather than a liability. On TikTok, young creators spliced the clip with overlays reading volumes vertical, pointing out that Clinton raised his voice while Crockett raised her documentation. As the cycle rolled, a meta-narrative solidified. Clinton represented volume, nostalgia, and authority, while Crockett embodied precision, receipts, and verification. Polling firms that measured instant reactions in focus groups reported that Crockett's composure scored higher than Clinton's applause lines. The more the clip spread, the more the storyline tilted in her favor. She wasn't just defending herself. She was redefining what credibility looked like in an era where people trusted documentation over declarations. By the end of the week, the media eruption had burned through its first cycle. But unlike most flashpoint controversies, this one didn't fade. It stuck because it wasn't just a scandal. It was a referendum on the terms of respect inside the party and on who got to define what counted as qualified. The moment quickly escaped the bounds of cable chatter and reached the spaces where politics is lived: barbershops, church basements, classrooms, and kitchen tables. In South Dallas, a barber told a customer mid-trim she read him like a motion to compel. The room laughed, not at Clinton's expense, but in recognition of Crockett's methodical style. In Detroit, a pastor's study group repeated the line, "Let's review yours," like it was scripture, breaking down how a single sentence shifted the balance of authority between a former president and a sitting congresswoman. In living rooms and family group chats, reactions fractured along generational lines. Older Democrats who had come of age during Clinton's presidency struggled with the moment. Some clung to loyalty, arguing that Crockett should have shown more deference. But even among Clinton loyalists, there was an undercurrent of respect for how she handled herself. "She didn't raise her voice," one grandmother in Atlanta texted her granddaughter. "She stood there with facts." That's how you do it. Younger Democrats and activists, by contrast, saw no ambiguity. For them, Crockett's poise wasn't just admirable, it was aspirational. She had shown that the old guard's shadow could be met head-on without flinching. Law schools picked it apart like a landmark case. Professors projected the clip onto classroom screens, freeze-framing Crockett's pacing and sentence construction. Students annotated transcripts of her remarks, circling where she used statutory language to reframe the conversation, underlining the pivot where she dropped the Arkansas committee order into the room like a gavel strike. Crockett's folder became a symbol not just of preparation, but of an ethic. If you respect the work enough to document it, you'll never be unarmed in debate. Black women's organizations saw themselves reflected in her composure. For decades, professional women of color had endured questions about credibility, experience, and respectability. Crockett's response wasn't just personal, it was collective. "We're not interns to your legacy," one statement read from a national coalition. Within 48 hours, fundraising pages lit up with donations tagged with hashtags like "contributions poured in," not from large donors, but from teachers, nurses, and hourly workers who recognized themselves in her calm but unyielding stance. The hashtags carried their own power. New Guard Now trended by the end of the week, as clips of Crockett's exchange with Clinton found their way into reels, duets, and stitched reaction videos. One viral meme showed Crockett snapping open her folder with the caption, "Documentation is a light switch." It was shared millions of times, transcending political subcultures and reaching spaces where politics rarely enters. Even apolitical viewers who stumbled upon the clip felt the pulse of something larger, a sense that decorum had finally collided with accountability and that the outcome favored receipt. Older Democrats remained divided, but many conceded that something irreversible had happened. The tension between reverence for legacy and hunger for accountability had been exposed in public view, and it could not be neatly tucked back into donor talking points. For Clinton, it was a reminder that his charisma no longer guaranteed control of the room. For Crockett, it was proof that calm documentation could slice through nostalgia and reposition power. By the time the second week closed, the public reaction had hardened into consensus. Crockett hadn't merely survived the clash, she had reframed the terms of debate inside the Democratic Party. Behind the scenes, the institutional machinery of politics began to shift. Donor math recalibrated almost overnight. While Clinton's events had always drawn large checks from established circles, Crockett saw a surge in small-dollar donations that reveled presidential candidates. Act Blue reported spikes whenever her clip aired, and by the end of the month, Crockett's campaign war chest had doubled. National committees, sensing the winds, quietly reshuffled speaker rosters. A Clinton keynote scheduled for a high-profile donor retreat was replaced with a panel highlighting next-generation leadership, featuring Crockett as a last-minute addition. Party leadership huddled in closed rooms, the kind where policy takes a backseat to narrative control. The phrase that surfaced repeatedly was, "Unity doesn't mean silence." Draft talking points emphasized respect for experience across sectors, a coded acknowledgement that courtroom lawyering, even in public defense, counted as real governing experience. The pivot was subtle but unmistakable. Crockett's resume, once whispered about as too narrow, was now being folded into the party's definition of readiness. Clinton's camp moved carefully, issuing a statement praising the passion of young leaders. But political insiders read it as retreat. He had gone on offense and lost, and in politics, perception is currency. Allies who once relied on his voice to quiet dissent began hedging, citing the importance of new perspectives. The ground under his reputation, long thought unshakable, had shifted just enough to matter. Professional bodies seized the moment to reaffirm standards. State bar associations issued notes underscoring that public defense is not entry-level but a specialized, complex practice. Legal magazines published essays titled, "The Indigent Defense Advantage," spotlighting Crockett's approach as a model for how trial experience builds governing skill. The subtext was clear. Clinton's dismissal wasn't just about Crockett, it was about an entire profession that had been undervalued. Academia joined the chorus. Political science departments framed the clash as a case study, how recedes invert power in intra-party hierarchies. Graduate seminars debated whether the balance of influence was shifting permanently toward leaders who embraced verification and away from those who relied on rhetorical dominance. One professor at Harvard described it bluntly. This was a moment when documentation outdulled charisma. The ripple effects weren't only theoretical. Invitations poured in for Crockett to keynote major conferences, panels, and leadership retreats. Her name began circulating as a possible chair for influential committees, positions that once felt out of reach for a freshman lawmaker. Every invitation carried the same theme: standards and proof. In a party wrestling with generational handoffs, Crockett had turned a moment of attack into a platform for authority. The institutions that shape politics. Donors, committees, bar associations, universities, had absorbed the lesson. Respect was no longer inherited, it was documented. And Crockett had proven she could do both, respect the work and wield the receipts. What happened inside that forum hall didn't stay there. Within hours, clips of the exchange between Bill Clinton and Jasmine Crockett were circulating across TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube with captions that turned into cultural shorthand. On college campuses, student forums lit up with late-night debates. Who actually gets to define what makes someone qualified in American politics? Was it decades of power broker experience? Or was it the daily grind of defending people against a system tilted against them? Students who normally rolled their eyes at political theater suddenly found themselves parsing case citations and ethics orders, realizing that the performance of professionalism was being upended by the presence of documented proof. For many, this was the first time they saw constitutional law collide with cultural storytelling in real time. Many town halls across the country echoed the same questions, but with an even sharper edge. Public defenders, often treated like invisible laborers of the justice system, found themselves invited to speak about the significance of their work. Families stood to tell stories of moments when a defender protected their rights, prevented an unlawful search, or stopped a wrongful conviction. Suddenly, what Clinton dismissed as entry-level looked like the frontline defense of democracy itself. Crockett's calm delivery had shifted the perception of legal work that, for years, was considered secondary. These stories began spreading not as statistics, but as human proof that the Constitution lives or dies on whether the poorest among us can access competent defense. The internet turned the moment into a cultural wave. Memes appeared almost instantly. The most viral one was simple: a slim gray folder against a black background stamped with the words, "Facts greater than flash." The folder became merch printed on hoodies, mugs, and tote bags, serving as both a rallying cry and a cultural wink. TikTok sits dramatized Clinton's stumble, contrasting it with Crockett's unflinching recitation of dates and docket numbers. College students began carrying gray binders marked with the hashtag "Receipts Matter," a subtle but powerful nod to Crockett's strategy. The folder itself became more than paper. It became a cultural emblem of accountability. Editorial boards took notice. Major newspapers ran op-eds with headlines like "Deference versus Due Diligence" and "The Politics of Proof." Writers argued that younger voters were done with reverence for icons who demanded loyalty without evidence. Instead, they expected sourced claims, even from legends like Clinton. It was no longer enough to trade on charisma or old glories. The clash between Clinton and Crockett revealed a generational realignment. Reverence could not substitute for verification, and truth required timestamps. The broader civic takeaway was unmistakable. Receipts had become the new political vernacular. Crockett's mantra, "Documentation as a light switch," was repeated in classrooms, barbershops, churches, and podcasts. A simple folder reshaped cultural expectations, setting a precedent that even the most seasoned politicians would have to meet. If you want respect, bring evidence. If you want authority, prove it. While the cultural tide swelled, the political machinery felt the aftershocks even more acutely. Within a week, booking wars broke out among Sunday morning political shows. Crockett became a staple guest, and her calm, folder-lifting moment was replayed before every question. Moderators who once treated her as a rising star now treated her as the arbiter of party standards. She was no longer asked whether she was qualified. She was asked what it meant to be qualified, a shift in framing that spoke volumes. Clinton, by contrast, was invited less often, and when he appeared, interviewers pressed him on whether his remarks had been out of touch. Behind the curtain, establishment Democrats recalibrated their strategy. Mentorship programs began to shift. Fewer lectures about waiting your turn, and more partnerships pairing younger defenders, organizers, and public interest lawyers with senior policymakers. Whip teams in Congress quietly acknowledged that the next generation would not be silenced by appeals to nostalgia alone. Crockett's moment had rewritten the internal rulebook, making it politically risky to dismiss defenders or grassroots lawyers as amateurs. In private memos, strategists began drafting new talking points that emphasized experience across sectors rather than decades in office. The fallout also carried a quieter, more personal dimension. Several elder figures in the party picked up the phone to call Crockett privately. They did not do it publicly. But those calls included quiet apologies, acknowledgments that she had carried herself with integrity, and even pledges to connect her with allies who could amplify her message. For Crockett, these calls were validation that standing firm in truth can shift even the most entrenched voices. For the public, however, what mattered was that she had forced the conversation to happen in the open. The long tail of the exchange showed up in unexpected places. Candidate training programs, which often used Clinton-era playbooks to coach future leaders, added a new module. Its title was blunt: "Don't attack what you don't audit." Trainers explained that in the age of live streams and searchable archives, questioning someone's credibility without ironclad evidence was not just risky, it was political malpractice. Crockett's folder became the case study, a warning to anyone tempted to condescend without preparation. The generational lesson was etched in every bullet point. Charisma can warm a room, but documentation can burn it down. The net effect was unmistakable. The center of gravity in the party tilted toward proof-driven discourse. It was not that charisma, empathy, or narrative had lost their place, but rather that they were no longer sufficient on their own. Clinton's stumble made clear that the bar had been raised, and it was Crockett, armed with nothing more than receipts and discipline, who set it. The political ecosystem recalibrated, not just around her, but around the principle that standards are not inherited. They are demonstrated. And for the first time in years, the weight of proof sat with the people demanding respect, not those asking for it. What began as a clash between Bill Clinton and Jasmine Crockett ended as something far larger than a generational spat. It became a mirror held up to American politics, exposing the fault line between nostalgia and accountability, between reputation and receipts. Crockett did not win because she shouted louder. She won because she trusted the evidence, trusted her training, and trusted the people watching to see the difference between charisma and credibility. This is where the lesson crystallizes. In an era of endless noise, of viral applause lines and carefully staged sound bites, Crockett proved that documentation is not just paperwork. It is power. A slim gray folder calmly opened at the right moment can silence decades of prestige and force even legends to retreat. That is not just political theater. It is civic clarity. It reminds every American that truth is not a vibe, not a memory, and not a favor owed to an elder. Truth is what you can prove, line by line. And yet, this is not a story about humiliation. Clinton's stumble may sting, but the larger point is that politics must evolve. Generational leadership means nothing if it cannot meet the standards of the present. Crockett's defense of her record was not about ego. It was about defending the very idea that service, especially to the poor and the powerless, deserves recognition. If a young black congresswoman with a public defender's folder has to fight for legitimacy against icons, then the system must answer for itself. That is where you, the viewer, come in. Because this moment is not confined to Washington or to a stage lit by cameras. Every school board meeting, every city council forum, every union hall, and every courtroom shares the same stakes. Who gets to define what counts as experience? Who gets to set the bar for credibility? Those questions are not answered by slogans. They are answered by receipts, by what you can show, by what you have done, by who you have defended. So the call to action is simple but urgent. Do not settle for speeches without sources. Do not cheer for applause lines that come without evidence. Demand the receipts. When politicians tell you what they've done, ask for the docket, the budget, the line item. When leaders dismiss the work of defenders, teachers, nurses, and organizers, remind them that real democracy depends on everyday service, not only on prestige. Jasmine Crockett's folder should not be the last. It should be the beginning of a culture where accountability is normal, not remarkable. That is how we honor the past, not by deferring to it blindly, but by carrying forward its lessons with proof in hand. And if you want more stories like this, more moments where truth cuts through the noise, then stay here with us. Subscribe, share this video, and join the growing movement demanding not just voices, but verification. Because in the end, the future belongs to those who bring receipts.